I wanted to talk with you about a phrase that I heard that I thought was really interesting. And it was this idea of like a social contagion. Like we can emotionally get riled up by each other or calm
Mhm.
down even by each other. And as a renowned psychiatrist, I wanted to get your thoughts and just start exploring it.
It's a very intuitive understanding, and it goes against the grain of our individualistic society where we feel like everybody's just responsible for themselves, and we shouldn't pick up on anything from anyone else, and we have to totally deal with our own difficult emotions within ourselves. And that's not true, because as we all know, we're born into families. Our family is our first womb and our first wound. I mean, however we learn to comfort ourselves, to understand ourselves, to understand our emotions, happens usually at a very early age. And a lot of people don't get that or get bruised and traumatized in early years. And so they don't learn to fully understand their own emotions, to comfort themselves, and that could cause problems. And also, there's a challenge with if you're exposed to hate speech or verbal abuse, that actually shuts down some brain circuits which allow for empathy and perspective taking. So there's ways that our brains get broken in a sense, and then that we don't learn to comfort ourselves, that we don't kind of propagate the connecting emotions of empathy and compassion. They're just kind of dented in us. And so we have to learn how to rebuild our brains and retune our brains so that when it's like we all affect each other emotionally. We affect, when you're in the same room with a person, you can affect blood pressure, heart rate, hormones, mood. All of these things are transmitted in very subtle ways, non-verbally and verbally, of course. And we just pick up on these things and we play a role in soothing each other. I think hopefully we've all had an experience when maybe we're having a difficult day and somebody just pats us on the back or says a kind word and that feels good, right? And so I think the challenge is right now there's dissatisfaction and frustration and all the difficult emotions that come out of just a deep vulnerability can just blow up and transmit. And we know that those anger is the most viral emotion on social media. So this tells us how our brains are, right? Also that these survival emotions, fight, flight, freeze, they can travel very strongly quickly within our own brain. It actually takes a lot of development to get beyond the fight, flight, freeze emotions to get to calm and compassion and understanding and all that. Those brain fibers take longer to develop. The cortex can take up to 25 years to develop, and then we continually reshape it with our experiences and our understandings. That's why therapy works and medications work. All of this helps us develop more ways to hold the difficult emotions so we can name and label difficult emotions and emotional experiences without turning them into a story, a judgment, a criticism, an enactment of what we have to do to get right, to get even, to I think we might tend to blame and scapegoat people, in our most difficult moments. Like, I'm unhappy because of that person. Well, so before we go to that, I think it's good to say, well, I'm feeling unhappy. I'm feeling distressed. How do I have compassion for myself while I try to work it out with that other person? So there's a whole level of development that we can undertake, and it's a spiritual and a psychological and a cultural task. I think that we, as a society, we're not particularly rational or compassionate about how we deal with suffering and dissatisfaction, particularly of minority vulnerable groups. Unfortunately, what's most aggravating and terrifying really is that the dominant culture, the socially dominant culture, really doesn't want to hear the vulnerability of immigrants, of poor people, migrants, and just minorities. I mean, women, we don't want to hear your experience, so we'll just do things our way. It's a profound shutting down of
Why
empathy.
do they do that when they have
Yeah,
the power? Why would they shut down
right.
when they're the ones who have the power? And and have the largesse, or the empathy bucket
Right.
that's full to give, right? If you have power.
Well, you can get a lot. I mean, I think they're good at getting attention and looking quote unquote strong. It's kind of this hyper masculine strength that says those people who are suffering are weak, they're bad. They're even the Christian nationalist folks say those people are sinful. If you're suffering, you're sinful. That
Mhm.
you must have done something
And it's
wrong. God is punishing you. I mean, this all these crazy delusions that are out there which are the third arrow of suffering. So the first arrow of suffering is the actual suffering. What's the injury, the difficult emotion, whatever. And then the second arrow is how we treat that emotion internally. And then the third arrow is how other people treat us when we're suffering. And we
Mhm.
can see, the LA fires was a great example, right? There's the first arrow. People died, people's lives were destroyed, houses were destroyed, communities were destroyed. And that's the first arrow. Then how do people treat their own suffering? Are they compassionate to themselves and others, in that moment of suffering? And then the third arrow, which really amplified the suffering, was Donald Trump and his crew making up all kinds of stories, blaming the city and, all this stuff, which was not helpful. That's the third arrow of suffering. So that's what we need to build is a container, more of a community that can deal with distress and sees that it's cruel to dismiss and devalue people who are having a hard time. So I think that's ultimately that takes the pressure off. If we all feel like we're safe when we're having a hard day or a difficult experience, that changes our relationship to each other, you know. So,
But, I would say that a lot of boys and men find that empathy towards others, so like acting like Trump towards people who are
mhm.
suffering, is this kind of sense like, you know, buck up. We're not going to give you sympathy because it makes you weak. And if you go harder into something, if you just, hey, brush yourself off, get back in the game, that's a very kind of masculine way of living. And so empathy feels like weakness. It feels feminine almost.
Mm.
Maybe not even
Well,
almost, right?
I think that's a very cruel form of masculinity. If you can even, it's toxic, right? I mean,
Mhm.
men are stereotypically you're supposed to be the protectors. Right? I'm supposed to protect people who I care for, right? Not to say that women, of course, protect too. I mean, so I don't think that we should, kind of make this gender differential so bad, but it is kind of this toxic masculine dominant, like, don't care. And J.D. Vance said something about, went back to Augustine and said there was a hierarchy of empathy. Have empathy for the people who are closest to you and less empathy or no empathy for people who are distant. He's arguing with the Pope because they know that caring for others interferes with their policy goals, which are just to amass centralized power for themselves.
Right.
But that interference actually builds a stronger society. When we're all more deeply connected and caring, there's a lot of details to be worked out, but that to me is strong. We're stronger together, right? I mean,
Right.
that's just basically a truism. I mean, what community isn't stronger when we're looking out for each other in some way?
I want to go back a little bit and talk about something you mentioned earlier. So I think we all can understand, like, if I walk in my classroom, let's say I'm in
Mm-hmm.
high school, right? And I walk in my classroom and everybody in the classroom's like, I'm going to pick up on that mood. Now, I might try to, like, joke my way around it. Hey, why is everybody, acting like this? But eventually they're going to share with me either their mood or their
Mm,
words, why they're all like, ugh, right? So that's kind of obvious. Like we can see that. But there's something that also happens, just like you said, like our hormones. I know, like women, when they get together, girls, when we get together, our periods after a while line up.
synchronize.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like that we are more connected in this kind of biological space beyond emotional space that kind of shows how much we are really maybe like a connected organism, right? We're not just all, like you started out saying, we're not just all
Mhm.
siloed in
Mhm.
our biology and our emotions and in our identity. How much we are
Mhm.
connected.
Yeah. Well, in relational cultural theory resonates with this. Suffering is a crisis in connection, and the opposite of suffering is belonging. So I think it's something we work at. I mean, we inhabit the same earth, we're walking the same earth, we're under the same sky. So on a very deep level, we're all connected. And yet, our narratives, how we think of ourselves, our identities, can be either disconnecting or connecting or ambivalent or ambiguous. So the space between us is always being worked out. And so I think we have to, this is part of our human task, is
Mm-hmm.
to not send our identities against each other, but rather find a way to coexist. That there's the great bumper sticker with all the religious symbols. We can coexist. I mean, it's possible. I mean, it's like whatever you have going on in your head about your beliefs, your spiritual beliefs, religious beliefs, political beliefs, etc. I mean, it all comes down to how we treat each other. And it's like, when we don't understand each other, well, that means we should do some more work, not not say this kind of person is wrong and the cause of problems, and therefore we should subjugate them, or their their ideas that this whole group has come up with should be banned completely. I mean, the free speech people over there, absolutist free speech, they're trying to talk about diversity, and it doesn't make sense. It's like, you have a hard time maybe understanding or dealing with a changing demographics. Okay, that's discomfort. That's Your discomfort has turned into a whole narrative of exclusion and dominance. It's like maybe you need more help dealing with your discomfort rather than letting those aggressive emotions go viral and become contagious. I mean, we started talking about emotional contagion because of what we saw happening in the political scene with Mr. Trump's emotions kind of lighting a fire with many people, and people like resonate that, feel like he was speaking for them in some way. He was saying things that they couldn't say, but maybe they thought. Or maybe he was amplifying the disconnection and the dissatisfaction. I mean, it's really unfortunate when you have a leader who, instead of trying to help lead the population towards a better union, a more perfect union, really splits us against each other. And he allowed that aggression to become viral, to become contagious. And I mean, it's going to take a lot to kind of like, get us back on the same page, I think, and to recognize that scapegoating immigrants and migrants, and even people, anybody you don't like, Democrats or whatever, that's not a way to a healthy society. I mean, it might score you points on a right wing talk show or on some layer of Twitter or something, but that's not emotionally healthy. We all like to pretend we're very certain about our identities, and we like to fit into a group that kind of, there's safety in numbers. That's true for anyone in the political spectrum. It can become hard to have conversations or to disagree with people who are in your social group. I mean, that's why people in the same zip code tend to kind of vote similarly, right? It's hard to disagree with your neighbors or to feel like they'll find out that you disagreed. I mean, it's, that's just, so that's just part of human nature. Okay. What is it? What does that fitting in do? I mean, there's a kind of groupthink, and you gain a kind of a stereotyped identity with sometimes probably the worst features of your group are magnified. Why elevate Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just to use an example, she just doesn't make sense. She's throwing out outlandish conspiracy theories. But she's good at getting attention. But she kind of, maybe they like that kind of feisty nature she has, tough again. So she's kind of defending that fitting in of the group, I guess. But I think that's the perfect example of someone who would make hay, and instead of saying, let's hold off on judgment about this situation where an immigrant or a black person gets involved in some kind of complicated something. Let's wait till the facts are found out. No, it's immediate blame and
Mhm.
scapegoating to make political hay, because that strengthens the fitting in of the group. Then it becomes hard when a prominent person kind of spews this kind of ideology. It becomes more challenging to disagree.
Right.
So there's that group thing. And so there's also a number of other things. It's all the G's. I'll go with the G's. So groupthink is one thing that's very dangerous. We have to challenge that as a democracy, right? I
Mhm.
mean, there maybe part of Trump's appeal is that he really disrupts groupthink. It's like, every norm is thrown out the window. How you talk about women, how you talk about
Mhm.
immigrants and migrants and everybody, just like disrupting it. How you talk about government is all bad, Democrats are all bad. I mean, all of this, stuff. It's really, so it challenges a group think. Okay, so maybe in that sense, it's kind of a great intellectual exercise, but it's like an intellectual exercise which is having very damaging
Yeah.
consequences in the real world. Okay, but so challenging groupthink. We also, as Americans, I think we're the most narcissistic, viewed as the most narcissistic of any nation. We're the most individualistic of nations, even though there's underlying it, I think there's a lot of actual interdependence and connection. And, I think
Yeah.
basically people are generous and kind. If you, in a pinch, I think, still, I hope that continues because we can all be influenced. This is the danger, right? But I think there's that general generosity and kindness. So that's a group think that I don't think we should change. I think we should cultivate generosity and kindness and empathy and so forth. So, but we also like grandiosity because we are more narcissistic as in general. We become more narcissistic. I think, although we passed the peak of that apparently, but we're still, a few years ago, according to research. But we're still, we tend to like grandiosity, big things, just,
Yeah.
America, I'm just like this big football stadium. And I mean, just, it's
Yeah.
so over the top, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's amazing, right? But
It's it's
it's
part of
also,
our personality.
it's part of, yeah, I mean, but it's kind of like, it's a mob mentality. It's a
Yeah.
grandiosity. It's like being part of that huge thing. And so then you get like this God, people with God complexes, I think, that
Ah.
capitalize that. They just have a talent for being, quote, larger than life. And so what did Mr. Trump tell us basically? When you're a celebrity, you can
You
grab
can.
them by the blank, which I say grab them by the country, right? I mean, so you're given this whatever. He seems to have some kind of God complex, and he thinks that, and people like have a grandiosity fetish, a fetish for people who kind of talk big, even though it doesn't match with reality. I mean, it's this weird magnetic appeal that he has because he's been a celebrity for 50 years, right? So these are all the weird things about us. I mean, and probably every one of us, we all have that capacity to idealize people, like, oh, put them on a pedestal, right? And what's the saying? Never meet your heroes, right?
Yeah.
My saying is, don't, back in the 60s, it was don't trust anyone over 30, right? And I say, don't trust anyone over 30,000 followers. It's a joke, right? But I'm like,
Yeah.
calm down. I mean, who is, it's like suddenly it's like so big to have a big platform. And I know people who nobody knows, literally. I mean, they don't have social media, but they're the wisest,
Mm.
most thoughtful, well-read people. Everything from a farmer in Kentucky to people I've met just in San Francisco. I mean, it's like, why do we idealize these people with giant platforms? I mean, good for them. I'm sure many of them can do some good, but many of them are just good at getting attention.
Mhm.
And so that grandiosity fetish, and then people get caught up and they take emotional guidance from these people, and that adds up to the contagion. Deborah Tannen, back in the 90s, wrote a book, linguist at
I remember that book.
yeah, so yeah, the argument culture. So she's noting how the this culture was becoming predominant, and actually the argument culture has become an attack and destroy culture, which is very dangerous. It's so devaluing because it enables hate speech and cruelty, which just totally looks to erase anyone who disagrees, and that is a canary in a coal mine for violence and for very dangerous things. So even some scholars have said these are the kinds of things which led to genocide in Rwanda, of course in Germany and
Mm.
other places. Well, this derogatory language, and so there's a difference. Like argument could help us understand each other, the exchange of views, exchange of perspectives. Like if there's an underlying sense that we're human, right? We should we should understand these different perspectives rather than simply trying to trounce the other party completely, you know. Uh, mhm,
Yeah, I like to always kind of point out that we developed from an evolutionary perspective the way I kind of explain it or see it in my mind, in a layered way. So what I mean by
mhm,
that is, if you look like that very simplistic view of the brain, for
mhm,
example. So the first thing we did, we had this kind of reptilian survival. I've got to breathe. I've got to, get out of the ocean and start to crawl on the land, and then, and my the heart, I don't have to think about my heart beating every time it beats. It just there's that automatic. Then there's this kind of second layer of, I hope I'm getting them right, where we started to recognize ourselves and that there was other, right? And so we have
mhm,
these kind of caveman tribes. And so we have this very primitive side of us, the
mhm.
inside of us, that I think gets triggered by a lot of this conversation about who's right and who's
Mhm.
wrong. And so
Right, right,
we
right.
used to like who's wrong, get that tribe because I'm gonna, and the
Othering,
homeless, the
othering. Yeah.
othering, exactly, and that's how the Homo sapiens beat out everybody. The Homo sapiens came out on top from a genetic perspective, right? We won, and we still have this very kind of primitive part of us that wants to go and get the other and annihilate them. And we're going out and doing it with weapons, but we're also doing it with words. And then we
Mm,
have this kind of, emotional side of us that remembers what hurt us, what damaged us, and then
mhm,
we carry that around with us. And then we get to this more the newer part, which is our thinking and decision making and things like that. And we're not using this enough
mhm.
in concert with our feelings to really
Well, yeah.
understand, how am I going to survive? I can't go and annihilate
Uh,
everybody emotionally, physically, conversationally. I've got to try to understand them because that's how we're
yeah.
really going to survive.
Well, this is the journey, right? And you said this perfectly. It's like, what is human nature? Okay, And I think a good argument I would make from my position as a psychiatrist is human nature is confused. We're very confused.
Full
We're
answer.
we're like we don't know what's going on. We're always trying to figure out what is going on. How do I keep going? And we're vulnerable. We're precarious. Things can feel tenuous and dangerous. We're not sure what other people think of us. We're just it's a good day. We like think we got it all figured out, but one minute you're a butterfly, the next you're pinned down. It's just on and on. So it's like I think we're basically confused. So Suzuki Roshi talked about beginner's mind, being a beginner with that confusion rather than thinking you're an expert. So I think we have to bring humility to understanding other people. I mean,
Mm,
my core belief is that what that ultimate vulnerability and confusion that's really deep within us, we have to treat that with kindness and compassion rather than running from it to some kind of power complex and saying, I'm vulnerable, so I have to dominate others to be more safe, right? I mean,
mm,
that's you see that happening in so many ways. Like, Donald Trump's father said, you have to be a killer in this world
mhm,
because the world is basically mean and antagonistic, and you
mhm.
just have to be cruel. And Roy Cohn, really amplified that with him. Attack
Yeah.
other people, attack the person, not the issue. So really personalize everything, and he just does that. So many of these people, they've kind of emotionally trained themselves to be kind of warriors, and you can. I think any of us, they're just human too. Any of us can really tap into cruelty, but we have to cultivate kindness. It like takes work to really cultivate that ability to remain true to your humanity despite cruelty. I
Yeah.
mean, I think, it's like, what is our human nature? Well, I can give you examples. Tibetan monks who were in prison camps in China. The Dalai Lama asked them, what kept you alive? They said, well, I cultivated compassion for my abusers, for the people who were torturing me. If I lost my compassion for them, I would die. That's the
Mm.
kind of thing they said. And Jews praying during the Holocaust, and somebody said, well, why are you praying to God? Why are you thanking God? I'm thanking God for not making me like my captors. So that holding on to humanity is a powerful form of resistance.
And it's a much more deep sense of, feeling good. And I'll give you a really silly example. Yesterday, that's a personal example. So yesterday, my son came home from school sometime in the late evening. He fell asleep on the couch. And I tried to wake him up. I said, don't sleep on the couch. Get up and do something because you're going to be awake in the middle of the night. Okay, okay. And then he turns back and he goes back to sleep. So, of course, 4 o'clock this morning, he gets
Mhm,
up and he can't go back to sleep. And I wake up. I mean, I always say that if a cat jumped on a car 2 blocks away, it would wake me up. I mean, everything wakes me up. So
mhm,
now I
mhm,
can't sleep. And I was so angry. And I said, I told you this would happen. And you're waking me up. And
mhm,
I've got a busy day tomorrow. And so I
mhm,
went back to bed. He's like, what? I had to go to the bathroom and I'm sorry I woke you up. Right?
mhm,
So I go back to bed and I'm mad. And I had to, and what I did in my mind is I started to be empathetic to him. And I said,
mhm,
look, I remember being 18 and I slept all day and that's what you
mhm,
do. And you don't know what's going on. Your brain's all scrambled. It's not ready to be an adult till you're 25, all that stuff. And by doing that, I could calm down enough to go to sleep. But if I sat there and stewed about I'm so pissed off. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take away this and I'm not going to do this for him because he needs to learn and all that. And I started going down that road and it just made me feel terrible. So there's something about cultivating, like you said, like the monks, being able to cultivate empathy for other people just feels better than stewing in your anger and your how am I going to get back at them and what am I going to
mhm.
do? Just a little
Yeah,
observation.
I know. It's like I'm very grateful for uh, Buddhist practice. I meditate 45 minutes a day because, you
Mhm.
know, everybody occasionally wakes up on the wrong side of the bed. And, just something's under our skin to just generate the space to sit with it, to not act on the distress, to be kind to oneself in distress. It can shift the situation, and thank you for sharing that. And I have examples like that too, in my life. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's only human to have moments like this. Um, and it's like comforting ourselves when we're in distress is a challenge, and then building communities that can understand distress, can manage distress, rather than
Well, let's
getting
talk about that.
torn
Like
up by it.
what are some of the tools that we could cultivate and teach that help people to tap into the empathy and that feeling of being connected that is in a positive way. And our logo or motto on our website is feel good, learn more, bounce back. But the first thing is feel good. Like what can we do when we are distressed to feel better? And a great example is, we both follow Dr. Bandy Lee, and I was just in the conference call, and people are so angry right now, and they recognize the need for empathy, but they also, we all need to express our anger. Like the whole country is falling apart and we are losing decades if not centuries of goodwill that we had developed around the world to doing good things or developed into all this stuff that's going on. It's
Yeah.
just like the economy is collapsing for no good reason, for the in service to a man who has mental problems, I mean, frankly. um so what are the tools that we can start to cultivate? so we can feel good.
Well, I think we first have to acknowledge and name the anger, the reasons for the anger. Um, anger is on the top, on the deep level. It just gets to be anxiety, fear, vulnerability, lack of safety, all these basic needs that aren't being met. Our needs for society to have a conscience, to be moral, to be just, to be good. Clearly, the society that produced Donald Trump has some deep issues, right? So I think we have to name the anger. I think we have to understand this context of long history landing on us. I mean, and I think what's been exposed in this moment is an abusive family system that's been blown out to now include the whole world. We're
Mhm.
all enmeshed in this abusive family system. So that abuse lands on us as individuals and as collectives. Okay, how do we transcend abuse? I think ultimately we can't transmit abuse into the system. We have to transmit some kind of positive, transcendent response, whether it's cultivating community, cultivating solidarity, learning, trading information, growing our minds and hearts, and recognizing that whatever little steps we do to create connection is a form of resistance.
Mm.
Whatever, I think even self care, as Audre Lorde said, self care is an act of political warfare,
Mm.
because, we as minoritized people, certainly, we can feel like society is geared towards our destruction, So self care says, oh, no, you're not going to destroy me. I'm going to try to take care of myself. I'm going to build community and resources and strength to, uh, so I can live, and we just got to face it. I mean, yes, people are so angry because, well, frankly, the MAGA GOP is like they're functionally becoming, a terrorist organization, really.
Yeah.
I mean, just put it frankly, it's like if you disagree with them, if anybody can be designated a terrorist now, that's what they're
Yeah.
just so lawless. I mean, it's such a deep threat to safety and every American value that I find wonderful. I mean, this country really has done a lot. I mean, there's been progress, difficult progress, but they threaten all that. They just want to take us back to a kleptocracy and just rule by fiat of a monarch. I mean, this deeply threatening. And so, but that's an abusive family. The
Yeah.
patriarch rules.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I talk a lot about Jared Lakoff. His
mhm,
I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He talks
mm,
about the strict father doctrine,
mhm,
which is that
mhm, mhm,
especially if you grow up in a kind of a patriarchal religious
mhm,
home, dad's on top, and then mom, and then the kids, and dad punishes the kids
mhm.
and mom
Right.
if they go out
Mhm,
of the norm, out of the patriarchal
mhm.
system, and then that gets you to be more attuned to who's above the father, some kind of godlike figure, someone who's stronger than
Exactly.
dad, and so you
Right.
look to someone
Right.
like a Trump or a cult leader or
Right.
something. So it's
Right.
very
Right.
interesting, but I think it's important. You're talking about this kind of family abuse, and there's of course our immediate family that we can come from an abusive background, our immediate family, but I think what you're alluding to, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the story of the Trump family and how that family dysfunction and abuse has now redounded to
Mhm,
all of us, and not just in
mhm,
this country,
mhm, mhm,
globally. If you think about the
mhm.
destructive
Yeah.
power that Trump has.
Right, right. And it's not just Trump and his family. I think a lot of people have suffered in abusive relationships. It's so ubiquitous. So this is his type is so familiar to many people. And honestly, it's very confusing because, it's like, think about it in a family. You're kind of attached to the patriarch. He may do some good in some way. He may earn a living or whatever, but then he's abusing mom, the kids, and talking, saying racist things or whatever. And it's like, people like find ways to, in families, people challenge the patriarch sometimes, but sometimes they just kind of let it, sit. They're
Let it be.
complicit. Oh, don't worry, dad just talks like that. It's
Hmm.
not a big deal. We've heard that about Trump. Oh, he just talks like that.
Right.
That's not, so dismissing that. And so this is a pattern that we've numbed ourselves. You remember at the very beginning, I said hate speech is numbing. It shuts off the ability for empathy and perspective taking to see the impact of that. It really
Mhm.
can narrow us unless we fight back and cultivate. So I think that's what's happened is so many people, because there is just existing cruelty in America,
Yeah.
racism and tough talk and all of this. And so people are kind of numb. Half the population is kind of numb to it
Hmm.
and, finds it difficult to separate themselves from a man they've become very attached to over decades, right? I mean, he's been promoting himself. He's gotten into people's heads,
Hmm.
and so they almost become psychic clones in a way. It's like they just like really so identified with him. And so,
Yeah.
it's like, wait, oh, it's like separating themselves from their leader, their quote unquote, the man who has the God complex and idealizes himself. And so commands that kind of idealization from others, that cult followership. And, it's, I think, so like when that hits reality, I mean, there's a lot of magical thinking that he has about being able to, have things his way, and it meets reality.
I think is really instructive when you talk to people who help people who are cult members. That, and you talked about this at first, that you have to cultivate a sense of self care first. If you're angry, if you're upset because of what's going on, if you see a loved one following a cult, for example,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah, you want to just go grab them out of it and shake them and say, "What's wrong with you?" But first, you got to take care of yourself, and then the path to empathy is really about trying to put yourself into their position and understand them, and if you can't understand them, then ask questions, allow them to explain
Mhm.
their own self, because they're in the end going to I don't think that deprogramming has ever worked, except that the people that are deprogrammed have been allowed to mentally walk themselves out of it, that they start asking the questions, they start saying, oh, this doesn't add up, and after a while they unravel their mind, and then they look back and say,
Right,
wow, I was
right.
really in it.
Right, right. I encourage everyone to also take a look at Steve Hassan's work at
I was
freedomofmind.com.
thinking
And
it.
there's, to educate yourself, to just recognize that some people can be misled
Mhm.
by megalomaniac leaders. They can, adopt a very controlled uh, personality to fit into the group. So that mind control is real,
Yes.
and it takes a lot to develop freedom of mind. We're all continuously influenced, but to have healthy influences on each other that support our growth and autonomy and learning and cultivating uh, deep human values, that's a healthy influence. Whether it's in a country, in the world, we all have to collectively decide that humanity can evolve past this.
Yes.
And it takes everyone. And so thank you for all your work on this. And I'm glad to add my own small part. And I know there are millions of people working every day, tens of millions, maybe billions of people trying to be good to the people in their lives and trying to do something more for the world. I have deep faith that that's the case. And so I know we will succeed. It may take a while. There's a lot of pain right now, but I have deep faith in the human experiment.
I do too.